I should say, first of all, that this is kind of a Turkey week that we have coming up, and Jenny is the lead-off act in our Turkey week. We've got a big conference on Monday, the 17th, on Turkey's emerging role in its neighborhood. It's a much more academic and boring conference than what we'll get today, which is more exciting and fun. But there's a poster for this conference here, and we've got some wonderful speakers who are going to be performing, some of our own and some from the outside. So I encourage anyone who has an interest in contemporary Turkey to come to this event. So Jenny White is one of those few academics who has come to the realization that in addition to doing the kind of academic work that all of us do, you could also do something fun. And as opposed to most of us who wish that we could do something fun that would actually reach an audience other than the 37 people who work on exactly what we work on, Jenny has found a niche to do that, and she's written 3 already. Maybe she's writing a 4th, probably.
No, I'm writing a scholarly book now to appease my chair.
Right, to appease everybody. But anyway, she's written 3, I would call them sort of mystery thriller, political history, mystery thriller novels, all set in the late Ottoman Empire. She's very comparable. For those of us who work on Russia, there's a novelist named Akunin who's been doing a very similar kind of thing in Russian contemporary literature, setting very rich historical landscapes in which a particular detective figure operates. And this particular novel, The Winter Thief, is set in with lots of political intrigue of Armenians and socialists and Ottomans in the very waning days of the Ottoman Empire. And it's a fun novel. It's one of those novels you read in a gulp. You don't want to stop because you actually want to know what's going to happen with the characters. And so I think she'll tell you about the process of writing this kind of a novel and what she learns and what we learn. And all I can say is you should buy the novel before you leave the room. That's the most important thing, of course, for all authors. And it's a fun read, so you will enjoy it if you do. So Jenny, the floor is yours. This is sponsored by the Keman Family Program in Modern Turkish Studies, this event, as are most of our Turkish-related events. So we're very glad to have Jenny back here at Northwestern again. And anytime you have a new book, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Scholarly or otherwise.
Thank you. Actually, Boris Akunin is one of my influences. Yeah, so I love Boris Akunin's work. And in the first, this is the third of a series, novel series. And then the first one, I actually wave at Boris Akunin. It's very subtle, but in one of Boris Akunin's novels, there is a scene where the Russian army is camped right outside of Istanbul, and there's a Russian general. And in the Sultan's Seal, my book, there is a scene where one of the women in the harem, the Sultan's harem, who is Russian, is up in the tower looking out, or remembers looking out at the Russian fires and thinking that her uncle, the general, might be out there. So it's a very subtle kind of waving at Akunin. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. The title was Turkey and the Winter Thief. So I don't want to disappoint you, but I'm going to be talking about the Ottoman Empire and the Winter Thief. And the Ottoman Empire, I'm not a historian, I'm a social anthropologist. I specialize in contemporary Turkey, where I have actually sat in this room and talked about that on previous occasions. I feel like I have all these hats, I keep switching them. So what I would like to do is just tell you a little bit about the novel and what I was trying to do, why I chose the Ottoman Empire, particularly the 1880s, and tell you a little bit about the characters in this, the third one, and do a little reading from it, and then I'll just open the floor to questions. And you're welcome to ask me about anything, about writing, about being an academic and a novelist, about contemporary Turkey, which is what I'm working on now. When I told the chair of my department that, a third novel's coming out, he said, "There's a third one?" It's like, oh, don't worry, I'm writing this scholarly book too. So, So anyway, as I said, this is the third of a series. They're all set in the 1880s, mostly in Istanbul. This last one, the main character, Kamil Pasha, actually leaves Istanbul and goes east. But mostly they're set in Istanbul. Why did I choose the 1880s? I've come to realize it's probably nostalgia. You know, I spent so much time in the present day Istanbul dodging traffic and, you know, gritting my teeth when they build yet another housing complex on what used to be forest. And I get so mad that I figured I can't possibly write a decent novel set in the present. That really what I want to do is talk about an Istanbul that is in our imagination and perhaps existed. I mean, I did a lot of research, historical research, to recreate what the city was like in the 1880s, down to what they paved the streets with, what the street lights were, the old street names, and then I extrapolated the cultural aspect of it backwards, which I know in anthropology is not kosher, but in novel, this is the nice thing about writing novels, you can do anything you want. So I tried to recreate the 1880s, and I chose the 1880s specifically because it was towards the end, just as the empire was falling apart, but it hadn't fallen apart yet. So there was much that was still intact. You know, just as little as this book starts with the robbery and bombing of the Ottoman Imperial Bank. This actually happened 8 years later. In the 1890s, the Ottoman Imperial Bank was blown up by Armenians, and that led to a pogrom against Armenians in Istanbul, where tens of thousands of Armenians were killed. And that, to me, is sort of the beginning of the end of the sort of peaceful coexistence of people of all kinds of religions, ethnic background. I mean, ethnicity is a 20th century invention. People didn't think of each other in terms of ethnicity in those days. It was religious differences, but even so, they would be in the same households. There would be people of all kinds of origin and religion in the same household interacting. There was a babble of languages on the streets of Istanbul. So the structure that kept all that in place was still relatively intact. And the main character, Kamil Pasha, Pasha, well, most of you will know this, but it means kind of lord. Lots of people who don't know this think it's his last name, and they keep calling him Mr. Pasha. So, so Kamil is a magistrate. In the first book, he's a magistrate in the Nizamiye courts of Beyoğlu, Istanbul. That is the new secular courts that had to come in the 19th century to kind of push out the religiously based courts, the Sharia courts, Qadi courts. And he had been trained in England. They had many of these new bureaucrats. These are the same people. Kamil is of the class of people who had been trained abroad, who are really bureaucrats in many ways, interested in science and so on, who became the Young Turks, who then eventually overthrew the Sultan. So in a way, he presages much of that in terms of his attitudes, his interests, with the difference being that he really believes in the structure and the culture of the Ottoman Empire. And there were actually, in history, many such people. And they were sort of, you know, the winner gets to write history. So the people who were of the young Ottomans and then the Young Turks who really wanted to save the empire in its very multi-denominational, you know, form were pushed out eventually by the Young Turks, who were nationalists. And nationalism, you know, Turkey for the Turks, that was something that was imported from Europe. So he is one of those young men who will later become very powerful. That group will become powerful, but he's one of them, one of the subset who believes that we should not be, you know, trying to make some kind of nation state. We should be trying to save what he believes is a just system. And he is in the law. And the law at the time, I just heard a very interesting talk yesterday at Harvard by Engin Akarlı, who talked about how the legal system of the Ottoman Empire until the end of the 19th century was really based not on punishment, you break the law, you get punished, but it was based on reconciliation. You get people in the courts and then you get people to pressure them from outside until they kind of agree, and then you make a deal. And then if you don't keep to the deal, then you get punished. But the whole idea is reconciliation, and that's in the Muslim courts. And there were all these courts as well that were sort of semi-autonomous, that were run by the Jewish community, the Armenian community, and so on. So there was a lot of devolution of responsibility for keeping the society going, for making sure people keep their nose clean. That wasn't just from above, but there were many other people and mechanisms involved that really helped to make this a flexible enough system that it could last for 600 years. So Kamil totally believes that this system is good. And he points to the backdrop to all three of these books is in the 1880s you had in all of the territories, the provinces, the Ottoman provinces around the edges of the empire, you had independence movements that often ended up in bloodletting. So the second book, The Abyssinian Proof, has as its background, that becomes part of the plot, Macedonia, the independence of Macedonia as a province, and then it was given back to the Ottomans. And in the meantime, there were massacres of Muslims who would then be streaming to the center, to Istanbul, where it was thought to be relatively safe. The Russians, 10 years earlier, had taken part of the eastern provinces. This is what Akunin was talking about. They got as far as Istanbul, the outskirts of Istanbul, before they withdrew. And the Ottomans lost a great deal of the eastern provinces. So the border, I had some trouble since I was writing about the eastern provinces figuring out where exactly the border was. And the town that I had Artvin as the town that I had set some of the action in. And I was 2/3 through the book when I happened to come across by accident a reference to the fact that Artvin was in Russia. At the time, I was like, oh no. So I had to, I couldn't figure out where the border was. So I had to invent a place name so that nobody could pinpoint, this was where this was. But anyway, the Russians, if they were in Artvin, they were pretty far in. I was surprised. So in the meantime, in the Arab provinces, the British were playing their great game, which ended up with Lawrence of Arabia, of course, fomenting the Arab tribes against the Ottomans. In the 1880s, they were busy, passing out rifles to tribal sheikhs and for using excuses that, well, there are intertribal problems and we're just helping them out, when in fact they were busy helping foment rebellion. The same was going on in the Balkans, the European provinces. So the center, 1880s, the center is still relatively stable except for the rising tension with these refugees flowing in. But all around was this bloodletting. And so Kamil would point to something like Macedonia and say, what do you prefer? The minute you get rid of the Ottoman system, look what happens. You have what he calls these cradles of blood. And so he is very determined, it runs in his family. His father was governor of Istanbul. His grandfather also was a judge. So, he has this sense of duty to society as well. Even though he is also, as I said, one of the class of people who will become the Young Turks who will overthrow that very system. If I write enough books, I'm doing one a year, it was 1886, 87, this is 1888. Let's see, how many do I have to write to get in 1923? There actually is a historical person called Kamil Pasha, who was a vizier at the time. And I didn't know this when I started writing. I chose Kamil because I thought it's a name that foreigners can pronounce. And also, it's, you know, it's not a real historic person. And then I discovered that there was a Kamil Pasha, and I actually had an email from a fan who said, I think from England, it's hard to tell, but said, "Thank you, I'm actually a descendant of Kamil Pasha. Thank you for letting me know what my ancestor was really like." I was like, well, I hate to tell you. So I was thinking, if I write enough of these, I could eventually merge if Kamil becomes vizier. I mean, by the third book, he's gotten promoted, sort of promoted. He's not sure if it's a good or bad thing. He's become the Sultan's special prosecutor in charge of things that might threaten the empire. So he gets these huge, you know, the Minister of Justice gives him these huge problems to solve. And Kamil always wonders, you know, is he doing this because he wants me to fail, because he doesn't really like him very much, or to succeed, because if he fails, there are huge repercussions. So I suppose he could become vizier someday. Then I'd have to look up the real Kamil Pasha. This is why I picked the 1880s. You know, and also in the 1880s, socially, I mean, there were experiments going on. I mean, people were experimenting with European lifestyles. Many of these people, like Kamil, had studied abroad and come back. Many of them spoke French to each other, and they would have, their households would be these mixtures. So you would have, for instance, one room set up with divans, you know, and in order to use a divan, you can't have a corset. You have to dress in this traditional way, you know, broad trousers and so on, and you would lounge. In the next room, you would have it set up like a Victorian parlor with a piano, and the young women would learn how to do the piano, and you also had the introduction of the corset. So if you have a corset, you have to sit in a chair. So you have chairs and tables and so on. So you have people moving back and forth with this. In the Sultan's Seal, there's a scene where a man marries. He's from a sort of bureaucratic class, and in order to get ahead, he marries the daughter of the ulama, you know, the sort of religious, very high-level religious person, family, in order to be able to, you know, move ahead socially. But he's doing this so he can be modern. He wants to be a modern man, and so he marries this woman from this conservative family, and he gets this position, and he wants to entertain with the men and women mixed. And she's like, "I'm not doing that." You know, and so it causes this huge furor where she basically moves out. This is all told from her daughter is the main character in the book, so it's all told in sort of as backstory for her daughter. So you have people trying to be modern in these sort of backhanded ways. And the other thing that's changing is their women's roles, especially elite women who are finding, partly through interaction with women from other parts of the world. There are actually, in the end of the 19th century, there are English and American feminists traveling all throughout this region and interacting with elite Ottoman women, and you know, they set up projects together and so on. There are a lot of publications, women's publications, that they write for. So you find some of that in here, where Kamil's sister finds, through means that I can't tell you, finds a new interest in her life that actually transforms her life entirely. That just by accident, it's something that she comes to see is something she can do. So there are all these themes that interest me in particular that I kind of weave in there. I have to admit, though, that I often don't know about these themes until after I write the book, and people point them out to me. It's like, oh, look, you have this theme. And I'm like, oh, yes, of course. But I'm not often aware of writing them. This book, in particular, has a set of themes that I was totally, well, not totally, but the extent that I embedded this theme in here I was not aware of until afterwards, and the reviewers picked up on it right away. But let me tell you first, before I tell you what the theme is, let me tell you first about the plot. Okay, so The Winter Thief is in 1888, and it starts with the Istanbul police discover a shipment of illegal weapons in Istanbul harbor. And the next thing that happens shortly thereafter is that somebody robs and blows up the Ottoman Imperial Bank, setting a number of other things in motion. So because of all of the warlike things happening at the borders, the Sultan is very interested in figuring out who wanted those weapons, what were they going to use them for, and who has the stolen gold, and are they going to use it against the empire? And, so he calls in Kamil Pasha, and Kamil, says, okay, we have the usual list of suspects. It could be anyone. It could be the Russians, the British, the French, the Armenians, the Greeks, there was also an early version of the Young Turks who wanted their parliament back, which had been closed down by the Sultan. So there was internal strife as well. But it could have been any number of people, groups, and so he's supposed to find out who. And I don't think it's giving too much away to say that he discovers very soon that it was none of the usual suspects, that this all had to do with a socialist group that had come to Turkey and in the eastern province in the Çorum Valley had set up a utopian commune. And this is, for the time in 1880s, 1890s, is very common. The socialist movement had branches all over Europe, in the United States, and was spreading in the world. The Communist Manifesto had been translated into many languages. The utopian communes were being set up in a variety of places, including one, I believe, in California that didn't last very long. So this is actually true. And at the time, in the 1880s, there was an Armenian socialist group that was founded in Geneva by Russian Armenian students who were studying there, called the Henchak group. But they were socialists. They were not nationalists, right? They were interested in workers of the world unite against people who may be Armenian, but they're not workers. They're going to oppress you. So, and they were working together with other types of socialists. So anyway, the people who came to the Ottoman Empire had this plan. They chose the Çorum Valley because the Çorum Valley, how many of you have ever been to the Çorum Valley? It's in eastern Turkey, not far from the Russian border, the then Russian border. And it has a very interesting microclimate. It's a beautiful place, but it has a climate where you can even grow lemon trees. So they thought that this would be a good place to go, and they also thought at the time this was an Armenian valley, that since some of them were Armenians, even though that didn't play any role in their raison d'etre, that they might be more welcome if they were in this valley, if they could say, well, some of us are also Armenians, which it didn't turn out to be the case at all. In fact, these people were so hapless that there was some question as to whether they would even survive the first winter. So you have this bunch of hapless socialists who, they lost their weapons, which they were trying to get the weapons to make sure these Russians didn't. This was before the Soviet Revolution. This was the Tsar. That the Russians didn't come in over the border, which was very nearby, and wipe them out. So. And they thought with the gold, we can buy new weapons and so on. So Kamil discovers this. And so he thinks this is a pretty open and shut case. You know, these people are, you know, really not going to survive. We'll just get rid of them. And but before long, the whole thing spirals very badly out of control. And the reason for that is that there is the Sultan has his own secret police, the head of which is a man called Vural. Vural is very ambitious. The Sultan is thinking about expanding his secret police to a real secret service like the British have, which the Ottomans didn't have at the time, the Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, which was founded some years later, but it was sort of, people were thinking about it, you know, that the empire was riddled with everybody else's spies, but they didn't have their own spies except on their own, for their own people. So this would have been this would be a huge undertaking. Vural would be much more powerful, and he wanted that job. He wanted to be the head of this Teşkilat-i Mahsusa. So he decided that this is a great opportunity. The weapons shipment, the gold, the robbery, the explosion, particularly the explosion, and so he convinces the Sultan Abdul Hamid, that this is actually an Armenian nationalist attack on the empire together with the Russians. Why else would they be over on the Russian border, and so on? Doesn't say anything about socialism. So, and that way he, Vural, can save the empire. He can even save the Sultan's life. Surely there's going to be an attempt on the Sultan's life that he can then, you know, stop. And so Kamil discovers that Vural is planning to go to this valley and massacre not only the survivors of this brutal winter in the commune, but the entire valley. You know, you could just see him thinking, "You're going to what?" You know, this is just an ordinary crime. It's like, well, you're out of it, you know. And so this battle begins between Kamil and Vural. So, which really makes this not a mystery, but makes it a thriller. I once asked my agent, because when I started writing novels, I didn't know there was such a thing as a genre. So, you know, it's like, what genre is this? I don't know, what's a genre? So the first book has a mystery in it. The second book is, I suppose, mystery. It's sort of like a Muslim Da Vinci Code, only much better. And this book, you know who Vural is and what he plans to do. And so my agent said, in a mystery, you don't know you don't know who did it until the end. And the whole book is about finding out. In a thriller, you know who did it or who's going to do it, and it's a battle of wits to try to stop the person or find the person. So I suppose this makes it's a thriller. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you what happened. You have to read it. So that's really the part of the plot, a very superficial starting point for the plot. The theme that I said that I discovered I had embedded in this book in a very visible way that was completely invisible to me when I was writing it, is how people are shaped by these kinds of catastrophic events. So if there's a war or a massacre, I mean, what is right and wrong? You know, I mean, we think that in war people have a simple choice. You have the choice between being good or being bad or evil. You know, you're either the resistance fighter or you are the collaborationist. But I think that people in situations of great catastrophe don't really have that luxury. I think they often are faced with choices between bad and bad. So if you're faced with that kind of choice, what would you do? You know, so I try to put a lot of the characters in situations like that to see what they would do. You know, what would you do to survive? How far would you go to safeguard your family or your friends, right? I mean, and what would that do to you? You know, if that was your bad choice. So these are the sorts of things that I I look at in here. Since the reviewers have all pointed this out, I sort of started thinking about, why am I so interested in this? And I realized that I've never been in a war, but I feel like I have because I was brought up in Germany and I have a great big family there. And all of my aunts and uncles and my mother lived through World War II. And they lived through World War II in a city called Würzburg, which was completely bombed to smithereens. I mean, it was completely demolished 3 days before the end of the war. But it had been bombed many times before. So I feel like I've lived through this because every single one of my relatives has told me in great detail over and over and over, and when they're telling, it's like they're reliving every detail of things that happened to them, the memorable, horrible things that happened to them, the kinds of choices they had to make, the things people did to them or didn't do to them, and it's an incredibly emotionally wrenching experience for people who live through these things. And I think it's the same for everyone. It doesn't matter what side. If you're living through a war, your experience of it is very intimate. It has to do with your own choices, what happens to you. You have a narrative of how you lived through this and what choices you made. So that's one of the things that very much interests me and that I guess I played with unconsciously in this book. This book actually came out right when the Armenian Genocide Resolution came out of committee in Congress. And so when I started on the book tour, people wanted to talk about that. Do you think it was genocide or not? I was like, well, I'm not going to answer that, one, because I'm not a historian, and two, because my approach to this is to say that no matter who you were, you lived through this in this very intimate way. This is sort of my answer to that, and it's not a simple answer, and I don't think it's ever a simple answer. States have a lot to do with it. They can be active in promoting war or catastrophe, or they can be passive. You can, for instance, just take away the protection that groups had. You don't actually have to do anything. You can just let it be known that it's okay to turn your neighbor in and then you get their land. So, you have these situations that come up over and over in Bosnia, in World War II, in World War I, in the Ottoman period, where people who have known each other all their lives, they're friends, they've had tea with each other, they herded their animals on the same pastures, and yet, like in Bosnia, they would allow their neighbor's door to have a cross painted on it or a mark put on it so that, when they came around to kill people, they would go only to those houses and not to the other houses, and so on. And, these are people who were friends. How do you explain that? To me, that is a much more important question from a sort of larger moral point of view than, who placed the order for what. So these are, this is sort of my response to that, I guess, although I thought I was writing about something else when I was writing it, but in the end, that's what came out. So that's a theme. And so what I will do is read you a little bit, just a few sections that illustrate it. There's very little of Kamil Pasha because I realized that all the sections with Kamil in it are, they give away the plot. So he has very little presence here in the reading, but is obviously the central character. But I want to start with the socialists. So the socialists, there's a man called Gabriel Arti, who is a Russian, happens to be Armenian, who is one of the people behind the robbery and the weapons shipment, but also behind the utopian commune. And his wife, Vera Arti, who is a girl from a a young woman from a bourgeois Russian family, also Armenian, and she has fallen in with the Henchuk movement in Geneva, where she was studying, and then she married Gabriel RT, and they have come together to Istanbul. Although Gabriel doesn't really tell her what he's doing, but she has her own project. Starts on the Armenian Christmas, which is January 6th. Christmas Day, January 6th, 1888. The elderly publisher put on his spectacles to examine the enameled pin in his hand. It displayed a symbol of broken chains draped across a sword, an axe, and a red flag. He handed the pin back to the young woman as if it were poison. Vera had gotten lost in the twisted lanes leading to Babi Ali, the publishing district, and ended up down by the harbor, then had to work her way back up the hill on the boulevard where she might be seen. But she had been late for her meeting with the publisher and didn't want to risk getting lost again. It was only 5 o'clock, but already dark from the approaching storm. The street was nearly deserted. The few men she passed were wrapped up against the cold, and she could see only their eyes. As she approached the center of the district, the buildings became more substantial, with ornate porticos, but their windows were blank, reflecting back the gray sky. All the Armenian businesses were closed for Christmas. Her own family's house in Moscow would be blazing with warmth and light, Vera thought with a pang of regret. She hurried along Jalalolu Street, peering at the names across the entrances, and finally, gratefully, turned into a doorway marked Agopian Brothers Publishing House. Now Vera was sitting in a chair before the publisher's desk. Curls of auburn hair darkened by moisture stuck to her cheeks. He reminded her of her grandfather, whom she remembered sitting at a desk much like this one, waiting impatiently for his granddaughter to speak her mind. The logs in the fireplace throbbed deep red. Shelves were crammed with books, and a long table was heaped with manuscripts. The publisher's desk, however, was as organized and tidy as the man himself. Vera noticed a vase of pine boughs in a window niche. Beside it lay a pomegranate, symbol of luck in the new year. "I'm sorry to interrupt you on Christmas Day," she said, pocketing the pin, the symbol of the Armenian Socialist Henchuk organization. "But I wanted the chance to speak to you alone. Thank you for coming to your office." "I wish you a blessed Christmas, my daughter. What can I do for you?" They spoke in Armenian, his voice cultured and precise, hers heavily accented. Her parents had spoken only Russian at home. What she knew of the language she had learned from her grandmother, and later from fellow Armenian students studying in Geneva. Vera reached inside her coat and pulled out a manuscript. She placed it on the desk between them. "The Communist Manifesto," the publisher read the title out loud, "by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels." He flipped through the pages. "It's in Armenian." "Exactly. You want me to publish this?" "Yes." "Look here, madame, what did you say your name was?" "Lena," she lied. "Lena Balyan," using the name of a childhood friend in Moscow. "Will you do it?" A look of irritation passed over his face, disguised immediately by official blandness. "Explain to me why I should publish this." "It's the duty of educated Armenians like us to protect those of our people who are vulnerable, the peasants and the workers." Her words sounded hollow and rehearsed. She wished she had Gabriel's eloquence. He had grown up in the shipyards of Sevastopol and had acquired his many languages in the cauldron of the street. She had studied at a privileged academy in Moscow, but what had she learned that was useful? The Armenian people will find the strength to resist oppression only by joining the international movement, by standing shoulder to shoulder with other oppressed peoples around the world. Her face was flushed from the overheated room. "The manifesto has already been translated into English, French, Russian, Spanish, Polish, and Danish. It's a scandal that there's no Armenian translation. The publisher placed his spectacles on the desk and said gently, Madame Balian, I appreciate your sentiment, and to some extent I agree that we need to stand together. But from what I've heard, this is the stuff of sheer anarchy. If you remove the state altogether, do you really think men will support one another from the goodness of their hearts? He shook his head. No, I don't agree. If you remove the state, they'll rush to tear out each other's throats. They'll do that anyway. This way we can resist. There's strength in numbers. Something has to hold people together, Madame. We're Armenians. That's enough. We don't need someone else's utopia. An Armenian landlord has more in common with a Turkish than with the peasants plowing his fields. The fact that landlord and peasant share the same nationality is irrelevant. It doesn't mean the landlord will treat his workers any better. Peasants have to stand together, no matter if they're Turk or Armenian. Nationality divides people. Socialism unites them. Where is your family on this Christmas day? The publisher asked. Vera was startled by the sudden change in subject. My family? In Moscow. The revelation made her feel vulnerable. Are you not a member of the landed class yourself? Why would you think that? Your clothing, the way you speak. You've had a good education. Perhaps in Moscow it means something different to be an Armenian than here in the empire. What do you mean? Maybe in Moscow you have the luxury of being Armenian however you choose, by going to church, or by speaking the language, or just baking churek. But here we Armenians have a common fate, peasant and landlord alike. Fate, she repeated. It sounds very oriental. What use is a life without struggle? Ah, Madame, we have enough struggle to satisfy several generations. We are not short of struggle. I mean struggle for a better society where everyone is equal, where no one starves just because they don't own any land. Everyone wants to offer us a utopia, he said sadly. No one offers us peace. Vera hesitated. The conversation was becoming too philosophical, and philosophy, like poetry, had no end. What harm would it do to publish this, she asked. If, as you say, Armenians don't exploit each other. I never said that, he interrupted. So if Armenians are united despite their differences, then this would link them to something greater. Do you want to deprive the Armenian people of their right to participate in the greatest global movement of the century? He thought about that, drumming his fingers on the manuscript. I'm not averse to publishing this text, but I can't publish it under the names Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It would be immediately recognized by the Ottoman government for what it is, socialist propaganda. My publishing house would be closed down, perhaps worse. Then what have we gained? What are you saying, that you'll publish it anonymously? He shrugged. We could publish it under your name instead. Then it would be seen as Russian propaganda. A woman's name is less dangerous. That would be like sending a man into battle with a blunt sword. She rose abruptly, stifling her disappointment. Please reconsider, she pleaded. Madame Balian, you must know that Russia is threatening the empire's eastern provinces, he said with thinly disguised exasperation. The Sultan suspects us Armenians of collaborating with them. This is not the time to publish Marx's work here. He held out the manuscript, refusing to meet her eyes. She stuffed the papers into her coat, her face stern so he wouldn't notice the tears. Her gloves fell unnoticed to the floor. The publisher walked to the window and glanced out at the street. He hesitated, then picked up the pomegranate and handed it to Vera. I didn't have time to break this on my office doorstep in the new year, so I suppose I've missed my luck. Take it. May it bring you luck and success. Blessed Christmas, she answered softly, tucking it into her pocket. It was dusk, and the buildings at the end of the block were invisible amid a swirl of snowflakes. Vera turned down a side street that she thought led in the direction of their rented room in Fatih. The grand buildings of the boulevard gave way to meaner houses, three-story tenements with crumbling balconies arrayed like broken teeth along narrow, rutted lanes. Vera scanned the sky above the buildings for a minaret. Mosques were set in public squares where she might be able to orient herself. Gabriel would laugh at her for being such a novice, she thought. She fumbled to close the top button of her coat and realized she had lost her gloves. Expensive kid leather gloves that her mother had bought for her to take to Geneva. The thought of her parents brought on more tears. They would be devastated to learn that their daughter was a revolutionary working to overthrow the very system that allowed them to send her abroad to study. They didn't seem like the class enemies she had read about. They were kind to everyone. She missed them. Vera reached down and washed her face with snow. If Gabriel was in their room when she returned, he mustn't know of her weakness. She vowed to herself that she wouldn't go back to Geneva with her very first mission unaccomplished. They had been in Istanbul for 2 weeks, and Gabriel had been gone most of that time, engaged in activities of his own about which he told her nothing. He had tried to send her home after just 1 week, and she knew that he regretted allowing her to come along. She twisted the silver ring on her finger that he had given her as a Christmas gift last night, one of the few nights he had slept in their room. There had been no feast, no family, no anushabur, the sweet barley Christmas pudding that she loved. There had been grilled fish, onions, wine, and Gabriel. Her face heated at the memory of their lovemaking. They had been married shortly before leaving for Istanbul, and there hadn't been time for a ring or even a ceremony. There had been no privacy on the train and ship. Last night had been their wedding night. 2 feral dogs with scarred flanks and matted fur began to follow her. She picked up a stone and hurled it at them, but they only shied to the side, then resumed their pursuit. Hearing the call to prayer, she followed the sound and, to her great relief, emerged into a large square. The dogs paused at the mouth of the street, sniffed the air, then trotted away. Near the mosque, a group of ragged men and veiled women crowded around its soup kitchen. Smoke rose from its chimneys, and Vera caught the scent of freshly baked bread. Her stomach clenched with hunger. Recognizing the square, Vera hurried down the lane behind the mosque complex toward home, hoping Gabriel would be there. The snow deadened the footfalls of the man following her. All right. Now, as you can imagine, Vera is caught by the secret police and manages to escape. When she escapes, Gabriel is gone. She doesn't know where he is. So she seeks refuge with the only person she knows, the publisher. Vera woke in a room with an icon of the Blessed Virgin on the wall before the bed and lace curtains at the sunny window. It took her several moments before she understood where she was. The Agopian girl was sitting beside the bed, embroidering. She ran from the room calling, "Mama, Papa, she's awake." Madame Agopian bustled in carrying a dress and an armful of other garments. "Lena, welcome back to us. I'm sure a sleep did you good. When you're ready, we can serve a late lunch." She piled the clothing at the end of the bed. "I've had a few things altered to fit you. My seamstress can come and make any last-minute adjustments." She looked down at the pile, frowning. "I didn't want to wake you, you see. So I chose some things I thought would be practical. I hope you like them, but if not, please tell me and we'll find something else. You will do that for me." Her face was so creased with worry that Vera almost laughed. She was certain she would never again worry about the cut of her clothing. Thank you, madame. I'm sure it's lovely. You've been so generous and kind. She sat up and flinched. Her whole body ached. Her feet were blistered and scraped and throbbed beneath the bandages. She fingered the brush-like swatch where Vahid had cut off her hair. When she had dressed, she joined the family in the dining room. Ravenous, she devoured the lamb and vegetable stew set before her and drank several glasses of water. Eat more, child, Madame Agopian urged Vera, telling the maid to refill her plate. Her daughter watched their guest from beneath lowered lids. Monsieur Agopian sent his plate away untouched. Are you planning to return to Geneva? He asked Vera. I can arrange a berth for you on the next ship. I'll cover the cost, so you needn't worry. You must be anxious to get home. At Madame Agopian's startled glance, he added, There's no rush, none at all, but if I can be of help. It seemed to Vera that he was in a hurry for her to leave. Perhaps she should take him up on his offer. She could be in Geneva within the week. But she couldn't leave without learning what had befallen Gabriel and one other incident that I can't tell you. If Sosie had been... Never on, you didn't hear that? Okay. Gabriel had mentioned that his cell was based in Kurtuluş, but she had no idea where that was. She wondered what Gabriel would do and found that she couldn't imagine. They moved to the sitting room. Sleep had cleared her mind, and she began to think about her predicament and what to do. Vahid knew her by the name Lena Balyan. She realized that the only person who knew her by that name, and who could have told Vahid, was the grandfatherly gentleman sitting here before her, smoking his pipe. Yet without the Agopian's help, she didn't know what to do about Gabriel and this other incident. She was saddened by the thought that she couldn't trust any of them. Still, if Vahid learned she was here, not only she, but the Agopian family would be in danger. When Madame Agopian and her daughter left the room, Vera asked, Do you find it easy to be a publisher here in Istanbul, monsieur? I had the impression from our first conversation that you were under some pressure by the state. Do you know the fable of the fig tree? Monsieur Agopian asked her. Vera shook her head no. One day the gardener asked the fig tree, Why do you spread your branches so low to the ground? The fig tree replied, I have many enemies. I bend low so that they won't break my branches, and I serve them sweetness so that they forget evil. Vera thought about this for a few moments, then asked, Doesn't that mean you condone evil? Not at all, my dear girl. It means that the weak must try to sweeten the bitterness of the strong by being humble and by serving them. We don't really have another alternative. You could grow the fruit higher and starve them. He chuckled at her naivete. They just pull the branches down or come with an axe. What have we gained by that? No, we must think of survival. There are good times and bad. We make our peace with the bad and save our strength to take advantage of the good. But people aren't trees, Vera protested. People can do things differently. They could themselves take up the axe. Monsieur Agopian stared at her for a moment, then said gently, Young people always believe that survival is their God-given right, if they even think about it at all. But as we get older, we realize how weak and vulnerable we are, and the people we love. He glanced at the door through which his wife and daughter had disappeared. Vera nodded. Her suspicion of the publisher suddenly softened by understanding. He had so much more to lose than she did. But she couldn't ask him to help her find Gabriel, and she knew that she had to leave. She wished she could, talk to someone in authority she could trust. There seemed no one left in the world who matched that description. So just one more, I'll read you a very short piece that features another character, Omar. who is a character in all three books. Omar is the police chief of Fatih, Omar Lutfi. And Omar, I don't know where Omar came from. He's a really kind of rough character. He's a former professional soldier. He is the police chief, but he not only walks on the edge of the law, he sometimes walks on the other side of the law, but he gets things done. Something that Kamil has had to kind of come to terms with in some of the other books. And he has a very rough way of speaking. He's always coming out with interesting aphorisms. I actually don't know anyone consciously, that I'm not conscious of knowing anyone like Omar, but he's a very strong character who features in all three books. He's sort of gruff, bloody-minded, take no prisoners kind of guy. So here he is in the garden of a convent where they have found, the police have found, the nuns have found the body of a young girl and called the police. Omar leaned against the wall, watching the nuns hover over the girl's body. The stone was warm against his back, having absorbed and saved up the faint winter sun all afternoon. He fell into a kind of trance. The garden was so tranquil, the light leaning in sideways and backlighting the leaves so that they seemed to glow from within. He was content, he realized, with a wife who put up with him and maybe even loved him, or at least had the compassion to let him believe so. And since last year, the boy Avi, a street boy they had adopted and whom he loved as much as any of the sons he might have had but never could. Contentment was nerve-wracking, he decided. It made you always afraid of a fall from grace. What would it do to his famous willingness to take risks, to walk toward a blade or rifle barrel point blank, as he had done many times as a soldier, intent upon breaking the enemy and uncaring whether he himself lived or died? Surprisingly, that kind of bloody-mindedness worked miracles. More than one enemy soldier had turned and run. He couldn't now remember which wars, but he thought of all of them with fondness and regret, not for his dead companions, some of whom he still mourned, but for the old Omar, who he feared was now truly dead. He was startled by Sister Hildegard's voice close by his elbow. "You look tired, Chief Omar. Let's go sit on that bench." She was wiping her hands on a towel as she walked. The girl was gone from the table. The nun explains that they're washing the body now, that the girl had been strangled and tortured. She glanced sideways at Omar to see how he was taking this narrative of harm. "Go on," Omar said gruffly. "I've seen worse in the war." He took out his cigarette holder, hesitated, then offered the nun a cigarette. He thought she looked at it longingly, but she shook her head no. Omar returned the case to his pocket without taking one himself. "Cuts, cigarette burns, bruises on her arms and chest," she continued. "Who would do something like that to a young girl?" After a few moments, she added, "I too have seen war close up. Visiting such brutality on children is beyond evil." Omar wanted to ask Sister Hildegard which war, but a certain delicacy held him back. He remembered hearing about an Englishwoman, Florence Nightingale, who had cared for wounded British soldiers 30 years earlier at the Selimiye barracks in Üsküdar, across the Bosphorus. This nun didn't seem old enough to have worked with Nightingale. He had a sudden image of Sister Hildegard aiming a rifle that didn't seem at all incongruous. What did he know about women? "We can still be shocked," Sister Hildegard went on. "That's the only good thing." She squinted at the apple tree as if to find an answer there. "It means we're still human." Omar nodded. Another saint, he thought, not unkindly. As for him, the horror of war had settled well into his bones. Having seen and withstood the worst gave him a kind of immunity, but he paid his tithe in bitterness. Everywhere around him he saw the potential for neighbor to brutalize neighbor, even after 40 years of sharing tea and grazing sheep in the same pasture. No one was exempted, including himself. He knew what he was capable of. except for the few saints like this nun that walked among them. If he allowed himself to be shocked by the girl's brutalization, Omar thought, he wouldn't be able to summon the rage he would need to find and castrate her murderer. That's Omar having thoughts. So here, just to finish up, a couple of very short pieces that feature Kamil at the end, after I've put him through the ringer. You know, Kamil, poor guy, he gets accused of murder, he gets flung in jail, he commits treason. I mean, you know, he basically is, you know, he starts off the book, you know, thinking that one life, every death is meaningful, and by the end of the book, he doesn't know what to think anymore. You know, is it, you know, if you could kill someone cold-bloodedly and save other people's lives, should you do that? You know, he would never have even considered something like that before. He was helping people who in the future might well turn on the empire. He had subverted his soldiers to fire on their own. The Sultan could exile him or even have him shot for any of these offenses. Yet he felt he had done the right thing. Did moral decisions have to be worked out along the way? Or could one rely on a set of moral principles that applied under every circumstance? He found himself thinking that what was right today might not be right tomorrow, depending on the circumstances. He wondered uneasily where such a relativist attitude might lead him. So just one more little section. Here he's had a face-off with both the Sultan and the Minister of Justice. In the larger measure of things, the missing money didn't seem to matter anymore. He had come face to face with an evil greater than lying, stealing, betrayal, or even, he thought wonderingly, murder. 3 months ago, he would have argued on principle that one life was worth the same as many. Every unnecessary death, every killing was equally reprehensible. But that was before New Concord, the commune, before so many innocents had been trodden underfoot. So he thought, so he had been accused of treason, theft, deception, subverting the army, and killing the Sultan's men. He had compromised everything he believed in and failed. Kamil left the Ministry of Justice and turned down a narrow lane. He had no idea where it might lead, but he felt as though he couldn't breathe. He walked faster until he finally broke into a desperate run, fleeing blindly through the winding lanes. Omar found him, hours later, sitting on the rocks between the spire of the Ahırkapı lighthouse. It was dark, and the Sea of Marmara spread out before Kamil like a black bowl. Every 6 seconds, a light slashed the darkness as a screen pulled by a weight rounded the crystal that cradled and refracted the lighthouse's kerosene heart. Okay. Here we go. Hope I didn't give too much away. There's tons of stuff in there. New other stuff as well. So I'm open to questions, comments, whatever you like. Yes?
Hi, my name's Sana. I'm a junior here, and I guess like this is interesting for me because I'm a political science and English major, so I'm always asked. I'm interested in like these issues, like history, and I'm also interested in modern Turkey. So I said about there last summer. I'm going back this summer, so I'm obsessed with Turkey. But I kind of wanted to ask you like, how for you as a writer, and you're like bridging the gap kind of between literature and like history, but even though you say you're not really a historian, but dealing with like those historical issues. How like does literature give you the space to kind of like how has that been?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I guess like your journey with that because I'm always interested in how can you bridge those two worlds together
Mm-hmm.
in addressing like modern Turkey and modern issues.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how have you been able to do that as a writer and someone who's interested in like
Mm-hmm.
anthropology?
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it. I hadn't thought about this writing as giving me a space. I do know that in the first two books particularly, I put in a lot of my thoughts about what it means to be Turkish and what Istanbul means as a city that would never go into an ethnography, which has, my first ethnography was about the new economic system in the 80s and family structure. The second was about the rise of the Islamist movement in the 1990s. You never talk about raspberries in Ortaköy. It would be clear, night fishermen or, any of the million things that anyone who goes to Istanbul experiences that makes that place really come alive. Because it's a problem-oriented form of writing. Having said that, I do find that, especially the Islamist mobilization in Turkey book, has a long life, in part because they use it in classrooms, because it's written. I didn't realize this, of course, before, but I write in a very similar way, only everything's true. I tell people stories, I go into people's homes, what does being an Islamist mean to them, what's in their refrigerator, I give conversations, dialogue that I think makes it come alive in a very similar way as if I were writing fiction. So in a way, it's a convergence of style. Doing these, there's another convergence that's actually pretty funny. Doing these readings, in many ways, this is a more scholarly audience, but in many ways it's like doing vaudeville, It's very different from scholarly types of talks, but I find that my teaching style has changed. And it's not quite vaudeville, but it's been incorporated into my teaching style as well. So there's a merging as well, and there are moral issues that I deal with in all of my books. That. Culture is about what is considered to be morally right, what is the norm, what is transgressive, and so on. So I find that very interesting, especially in contemporary. I spent all of 2008 in Turkey on a Fulbright studying nationalism, which is what I'm writing on now. And, talk about polarization and people saying, you're wrong and I'm right. It's become really extreme. Really, it's breaking up families and so on. And there's an undercurrent of violence as well that, to me, should be addressed. I'm going to try and address that in the nationalism book, but obviously I can't address it as a moral issue. I have to address it more as a what is going on in Turkey, how do you explain this kind of issue. But I think that the heart of my attempt to understand where the violence comes from, potential violence comes from, is in the novels. And thank you for making me think about that. This is another one of those cases where I don't know what I'm doing until someone points it out. So I think that's probably what's going on. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the transition from the tolerant atmosphere of the Ottoman times to a more violent situation in the late years of the empire. So the Ottoman Empire seems to be this large space where many things can exist without contradiction, like Islamic law, Jewish law, secular law, divans and Victorian living rooms and everything. And then comes a period in which there's a lot of enemy making and scapegoating. People like Kamil Pasha are probably refusing that, but they turn out to be on the losing side.
Right,
more aggressive people like Ural become really important actors. One question is, why do certain people identify with people like Ural? Because it can't be just powerful individuals who make others play out their fantasies. Mm-hmm. But if it was so tolerant before, why would those people then become so hostile to each other and maybe identify with those leaders like Vural and exert aggression towards them? So, like, where do you see the transition? Is it in so what's the fear and rage? What's the aggression which is fueled and represented by people like Vural? Because it seems like his is just a personal ambition. He wants to become a important person, right? It's like a personal quest.
Well, he has an interesting background that explains his personality, having to do with his family and so on. He's much more than just an ambitious man. He's actually quite villainous in some ways. So I wouldn't put him as an early, young Turk. Although I suppose, yeah, the ambition certainly is there. I mean, this is one of those things where I, not being a historian, I can't tell you exactly what happened when. But to my mind, it goes back to what I said before, that there are certain points at which the government or the state lifts protections, or doesn't even have to do that positively, but just says, okay, we're not going to prosecute. Because this is like somebody, the Armenians blew up the Ottoman Imperial Bank as a political statement in the early 90s, 1890s. And so this is obviously a threat to the empire. And, so it doesn't take much to get a mob together. It can be, as in later in the, when the, was it when was the attack on the Greek shops in Beyoğlu? 1950. 56, yeah. So that turned out to have been orchestrated to some extent. People were bussed in, but you don't actually have to have that. All you have to do is say, to signal that these people are, undermining the empire. And then, people who had been their friends can bring their ambition or whatever is driving them personally to bear on this and say, okay, I can now get this person's shop, or I can get this land. I'm sure that when you get right down to who kills who, if it's not, an army under orders, there's an awful lot of ambition of various kinds involved in that. I went to a conference a couple of years ago in Istanbul of historians, both actually international historians, including Turkish historians. And one of the Turkish historians there was an early massacre of Armenians in eastern Turkey, and I forget the name of the town. It was way before 1915. It was sort of one of those single moments where this happened. And she went there to look at the land records because she wanted to know what happened to the Armenian land. And you can't actually say, she wanted to know who was living there, who were the populations that were there, and then what did it look like afterwards. They wouldn't let her look at the records from that period. So she actually, in a very sneaky way, told them she was looking at the later period, and then when no one was in the room, went and looked, which of course you can't publish, but she did tell us at this conference. There were three groups there at the time. There were Kurdish migrant laborers, and there were Armenian farmers and Muslim farmers. And the Muslim farmers were much poorer. The major landowners were Armenians. After the massacres, the major landowners were Muslim, but you couldn't tell if they were Kurds or not. So you can't really, you can't reconstruct what happened, but you can, from my point of view of a non-historian interested in, individual motivations, I mean, obviously somehow the land got transferred over. And similar things happen in every situation like that, I think. So I think it's the signaling or taking away the protections that allow individual motives to suddenly take form. And then when you get a bunch of people together, you have the mob mentality as well. You know, I'm not saying you have to be Armenian or Turkish or Muslim or Kurdish. It doesn't matter. You know, what matters is the situation that you find yourself. You have an opportunity here, and you know, all kinds of things like that happen.
I just had a couple of questions. First of all, did you learn Ottoman Turkish in order to do research for the project?
Oh no.
So
That would be,
Yeah.
then I would be a real historian, no.
Okay, well, I
But I
wondered-
do speak Turkish, so
Right.
I have as one of my major sources the Istanbul Encyclopedia, which is in Turkish. Hmm?
It's a very good one.
It's fantastic, it's got everything in there.
Right. And then also, are there any Turkish writers who are writing about 19th century, you know, fictional American events? Or,
Oh, fictional American
set here?
events.
I mean, that'll switch, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know if you're American or not, but if you were
Yes.
to, okay, if you mentioned you grew up in Germany, but it's sort of a mirror, so people that you've been doing
Well,
this
Turks tend to be very obsessed with Turkey. I don't think anyone here would deny that. So if they're going to be writing about the 19th century, it'll be about the Ottoman Empire. And there are quite a few novelists writing in Turkish about the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
I do not read anything written about that period that's fiction because I don't want to be influenced unconsciously, because there's bound to be overlap, you know, in terms of culture or historical events and, you know, because I use things that really happen as well. So this way, you know, if anyone says, well, I wrote the same thing, I can say, well, I never read your book. So I know there are some, but they're about Turkey and I haven't read them.
Do you read memoirs of that period?
Yes, yeah. There's a memoir of a woman who visited the harem as a teacher. She lived in the harem that just came out recently. What was the name of it? Zabiya Hanım or something like that. That was, you know, they give little details. I want the details. So in the Sultan's Seal, there is, I mean, there's so much neat stuff. You actually don't even have to invent very much. In the Sultan's Seal, the first novel, there is a scene where there is an Ottoman villa, and there's a floor that when you flip a switch, the floor goes down into the Bosphorus. Oh, yeah. So it's actually behind barred windows so the water can come in, but nobody can actually look in. And this is actually true. This existed. I found it in a book of architecture of Ottoman villas that no longer exist. And it was for the harem women. So if they wanted to, you know, go out in a little boat or fish, they could be lowered into the Bosphorus without anyone seeing them. You know? So I have a kind of climactic scene, you know, where someone's chasing someone in that, trapping someone in there. In the Abyssinian proof, a lot of it takes, actually in that book, it's almost like the city of Istanbul is a character. Because a lot of the chase scenes are in the Byzantine tunnels under the city. So, you know, these exist. You don't actually have to, you know, make them up.
But you have to find out about them.
Yes,
from
yeah.
other
So I
sources.
read all kinds of things for those little telling details, yeah.
Yeah, and your books are full of them, and that's what makes them so readable. Yeah. I wanted to ask about your plotting. Do you plot everything beforehand? Do characters? A lot of writers say that characters sometimes kind of, you know, resist certain plans, and
It's
you know,
true.
And you just
Yeah.
said about Omar that you don't know where he came from, right?
Yeah,
So-
yeah. Well, this is very interesting because lots of writers do have, you know, almost like a formula. They figure out the plot in advance. I wrote the Sultan's Seal. In fact, I was on page 200 before I realized, oh, I need a plot. Don't do it that way. I would never do that. Because then you have to go back and rewrite the whole thing. So for the Abyssinian, for this book, it's the Abyssinian proof, I made I had a general idea of what I wanted, but it wasn't really a plot, like what would this person do or what would that person do. It's sort of a general idea. This book, my agent asked me to write a plot outline. It took me like 3 months, 50-page plot outline. I sent it to him. It was like it was like pulling teeth, you know, but I wrote it, I sent it to him. He calls me on Christmas Day, I will never forget this, and he says, I hate it. I hate the whole thing. You know, it's like, ah. And, you know, unfortunately my agent is always right in the end. So I was really depressed for about 2 weeks, and then I went back to work. But I no longer, because a plot outline, for me, in a plot outline, the people are dead. They're not, it's you with like a mathematical formula in your head trying to figure it out. So I just sat down and I started to write, which is what I usually do. I'm never doing that again with the plot outline. And it's like being a human Ouija board. You know, these people start appearing, they do things. In the first book, there was a scene where one of the characters pokes her umbrella into a guy's eye and takes out his eye. And I was like, oh my God, she did that. You know, I had no idea she was going to do that. She just did it like all herself. But I'm not kidding. You know, it's like being in a trance. And you basically just sit there typing and things are happening. People are speaking. Omar is doing something. And I don't have any insight into that at all, which is probably just as well. It's scary because you think if you stop, it'll never happen again.
Now, last time you were here, you were saying that you were going to be working for the first time doing parallel academic work and fictional work.
No, I find it's not possible because both of them are obsessive projects that you think about all the time, you know. And so basically I wrote this over a couple of summers. I just sat down and did it and did nothing else. And then when I went to Turkey, I did some final editing, but I did the research and started writing the scholarly book. So there are many edits. You can't actually write the book if you're doing something else. I find I can't. But editing you can do. You know, it's like continual. These things go through, I don't know, like 50 drafts, and you know, because it's done, and you don't have to be obsessed about it. So I tried, you know, and it didn't work. So now I have to like get fiction out of my head altogether and write the nationalism book only.
And do you find that things, concerns that are in your anthropological writing kind of bleed into the fiction?
Oh yeah. Those are those themes. Yeah. These are things I'm interested in my scholarly work as well. And they, you know, I guess it's me, my own personality coming in there and interests. Yeah.
First of all, I really appreciate your approach to political problems between societies and focusing on more the human side of the issue. Because sometimes we are so obsessed with our problems with other societies, and we don't think about the reality of the issues. But we tend to forget the reality that the other side is also a human being, like we are. They have the, you know, all the human features. I'm really happy to see that you have the same approach. My question is that when you studied the late 1800s, and you also studied late 1900s, right? Church nationalism.
Well, studied, I mean, it depends. For this, I just did, you know, pretty superficial research. For the book on nationalism, I've read some things about nationalism, but most of my expertise, my real expertise, is in, say, 1950s on, maybe 1923 on.
And also, maybe depending on your personal knowledge, how do you think the events in the late 1800s affect the current impasse at the political and societal level between Turkey and Armenia, if they affect?
Well, you mean Turkey and the Armenian diaspora? Because then Turkey and Armenia, the country of Armenia, is a different, you know, because they're already building ties with the country of Armenia, and the Armenian diaspora is against that. So they have their own interests. I actually We have a chair in Armenian Studies at Boston University who I gave a copy of this book to, and I also gave a copy of it to the new Turkish ambassador the week before. So I'm covering all angles. Let's see what they say. He gave an interesting talk once about about the Armenian diaspora. He said that one of the things that characterizes the diaspora in the United States, not in Europe where there's a different situation, but in the United States, is that they don't really have much of an identity anymore. You know, they don't go to the church, they don't speak the language so much anymore. In Europe, they have these schools, you know, so it's intensive. It's sort of like the publisher said, you know, how are you able to be Armenian? And in the States, there's so much assimilation that he said that the only thing that all the Armenians have in common is the genocide resolution, you know, to fight that. And that you know, it gives a structure to the community. So in a sense, you know, you can think of it as, again, being about personal interests and not really being about Turkey at all. And this will probably change over time. I mean, obviously, there was a period where the Armenian diaspora was killing Turkish diplomats in the 60s and 70s. So that would have been a different set of motivations that would have been still much more raw in terms of being expropriated and so on. But the present situation seems to be about identity. So I don't know if that answers your question. In Turkey, the Armenian issue is looked at. This is actually one of the things I'm going to talk about in my book that I'm writing now. There appear to be two general approaches to Armenia, or Armenians. One of them is the sort of Kemalist approach that still is obsessed with the 1923 boundaries and fears that, you know, the Europeans, Christians in general, you know, this missionary fear of missionaries, in the U.S., the CIA, Mossad, you know, there's a whole list of suspects, are out to undermine Turkey, to break it up territorially, and also to undermine its identity. So this, to me, goes, and in the school books it's taught, and it refers directly back to World War I, when that actually happened. You know, with the sorts of things. Yeah. So, but that's only one part of the story. That is, because it's taught in schools, it's a very powerful idea. Some people call it the Sèvres syndrome, you know, after the Treaty of Sèvres, where Turkey was severed, basically, into all these bits. And the only reason there's a Turkey today is because there was a resistance movement that pushed out the Europeans and saved this little part of the empire for Turks. So the other is the one that is pursued by the party in power, the AKP. And one of the things that I went around asking people about who they were in terms of what is their relationship to the nation, what is their kimlik, their identity, as opposed to asking them what does it mean to be a Turk. I didn't want to presume that that's what their answer would be, right? So one of the things I discovered that you can divide people generally. There's another study that found this also. You can divide people generally into people who say, I'm a Muslim first and then I'm a Turk, or I'm a Turk first and then I'm a Muslim. And those two always go together. You never have a Muslim without the Turk part. I mean, so to be Turkish, you have to be Muslim, which puts everybody else, Armenian Christians, in a Turkish citizen category, but they can't be Turks. So there's already this, you know, that's an effect of the late empire, early republic, that it was, you know, Islam was used as a kind of way to glue what was left of the empire together, this new nation together. And even secularists believe that you have to be Muslim to be Turkish. But the people who put the Muslim first have as their concept of the nation, not the 1923 boundaries, but something much broader. They have the Ottoman Empire in their heads. And they're very explicit about this. So to them, they're not I mean, they obviously, if someone, attacks over the 1923 borders, they will defend Turkey. But their notion of the nation has to do with the Ottoman Empire, which means that they can have a special relationship with all the Arab states and with Armenia, Greece, that they don't have that Sevres syndrome at all that I can see. So that makes them much more open to interacting with Armenians as Armenia. But the other thing that they are quite explicit about is that their relationship to non-Muslims in Turkey has to do also with the Ottoman model. That the Ottoman Empire had a place for non-Muslims. They were in the millet. They had, they were sort of unequal, but separate, somewhat unequal, but meshed identities. And they're like, well, we can do that. We can deal with Armenians and Greeks. And so under the AKP, there has been much more movement towards dialogue with I'll put a caveat in that in a moment. Just a few weeks ago, there was a conference in Ankara on the Armenian genocide that was attended by Turkish and Armenian historians. I mean, it was under guard, but the government approved of this, and there was another conference that they approved of a couple of years ago that was going to talk about the Armenian issue from historians. And these poor people, it was supposed to be held at a university, and these nationalists came and threw eggs at them, and they had to go to another university, and finally they found a place where they could hold their conference. But the government was for this conference. So, this is a very different point of view from what's in the school books, which is that the Armenians and the Greeks are the enemies within. Not even to mention the Kurds, who are another whole other situation. Now, my caveat, I have to say this, is that these things happen at the national level, but at the local level, the opposite is happening. There is an increase in intolerance against religious minorities, anyone who's different, which I find very disturbing. So,
maybe after the talk I can put another caveat for
sure,
that.
go ahead. Caveats galore.
No, I don't want to take other people's time.
You want to put a short caveat?
Okay. Maybe, if anybody follows the developments in Turkey, some of those anti-minority events or aggressions turn out to be the fact that it was organized crime.
Mm-hmm. You mean Ergenekon?
Yeah.
But not all of it. Not all of it.
In some parts, people have that sentiment, but a considerable part of it also organized.
We don't know that. That's sort of an accusation that's in the courts, that there are a number of people under arrest who are secular nationalists who are under arrest for trying to overthrow the government, which has Islamic roots. And they are also accused of doing sort of anti-minority things and then blaming it on the Kurds or on the Islamists to try to discredit them. But there's an awful lot going on that is just on the street level. And this is the sort of thing that I'm talking about. It's particularly noticeable with Kurds. I mean, this poor guy answered his cell phone in Kurdish a few months ago, and he was almost lynched. So there's this sense that, the government, which is pushing through what they call the Kurdish opening, you now have a movie in Kurdish on Istiklal Boulevard for the very first time. You could speak Kurdish, which had been banned, and all these things. There's a Kurdish television station, but at the same time, there's also this removal of sanction. So if someone tries to lynch a Kurd for speaking in Kurdish on the cell phone, nothing really happens to him. I mean, to the attacker. So you have this removal of the protections, which is, and so at the same time you have a liberalization at one level and then the removal of protections at another level that allows these sort of more intimate, personal motives to undermine people and to kill them.
I guess I just see a lot of parallels between like the Armenian problem in the past and the Kurdish problem in the present. And in your experience, both in historical fiction and more modern academic work, like what do you think it's all about? Is it elite driven, or is it like an innate human capacity for like hatred and killing? It's obviously not a Turkish problem because these issues of identity and ethnicity and nationalism are everywhere. Is it a modern problem? What do you think? Well,
God, there are so many really good questions in there. It definitely, I think, well, I don't know. I mean, the notion of ethnicity, ethnic cleansing, a term I never liked, is a modern problem. I think because the whole notion of ethnicity is a modern concept. The media has a lot to do with shaping some of these things. I teach a course on ethnicity and identity in which we talk about Bosnia quite a bit. And Bosnian Muslim culture was not very Muslim, before the war. People didn't really have a Muslim identity. It was except that they would, have certain rituals. That's it. All the rest of it, they were, you were a villager, in these mixed villages. And the ethnic cleansing label was developed by the press. And then it became a fait accompli that people would say, okay, well, these people are Muslims, and it's an ethnicity, and, this is a group. And then in the end, the solution, the political solution, made them an actual group. And so now their language has changed to have more Arabic in it, which had never been the case before. Their women are veiling in ways they never did before. Bosnian Muslim families are sending their children to Indonesia to study. And yes, now they are Muslim in a very extreme way. That was a complete invention of the political process and the media. So I'm not sure how much, is the human ability to just, given an opportunity to enrich yourself or to, to be mean and cruel, that people will do that. And how much is simply an invention of identity that happens at the moment. For instance, what does it mean to be Kurdish in Turkey? I wish one of my graduate students would want to study this, because this is the exact moment to study that. Because until now, Kurdishness has been defined by the state and by the media. And so now, if you have this opening and the Kurds are able to have ads on their own TV, what are they going to show as ads? What's going to be Kurdish about it? What's going to be on their TV station? Or are they going to have to, like the Jews, be, very Turkish in order to feel like they can pass? It's a fascinating topic, but I don't know anyone who's studied it. Really? Oh, excellent. It's perfect timing. I don't have any expertise in the Kurdish. Just superficial. But I don't speak Kurdish, so I couldn't do that myself. I don't know if that's a really big question. Nationalism is modern because the nation state is modern. The whole idea that you have boundaries that are defined not only by political identity, but that political identity has an ethnic component. And so even in a place like the United States, where you have these people from like all over the place, you still have, and you had until recently, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant as a kind of default ethnicity for if you think of an American, who are you going to think of? So, I don't really know what there are as identities out there in Turkey at the moment, or where they come from, because I think that they are being created on purpose by the media, among other things. media has a lot to answer for in Turkey.
Okay. I think white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are trying to make a comeback, by the way.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Well, out of time. Usually we've got about an hour and a half. I don't know if you want to stick around, maybe take some more questions, but usually we would conclude by about 5:30. So you've enthralled us all to stay.
Oh, okay.
So I'd like to please, please